Missing a single Canadian tax deadline could cost you hundreds or even thousands in penalties. And the real scary part, most business owners are unaware of how the deadlines they are supposed to meet. If you think taxes are just about filing once a year on April 30th, you're not alone. So many people believe that. But that's not even close to the full picture. April 30th is just one deadline. And if you stop there, you'll miss installments, GST/HST filings, payroll slips, corporate and sole proprietorship dates. But what you won't miss, if you file late, is the penalties. The first step in avoiding those penalties and the stress is to have a clear understanding of all the key dates. And that is exactly what I will help you with today. When it comes to Canadian taxes, the hardest part is not just paying them. It's keeping track of all the different deadlines. Between personal returns, business filings, installments, GST/HST, payroll, and even things like RSP contributions or charitable donations, it's no wonder many business owners feel overwhelmed. In this video, I'll walk you through every major Canadian tax deadline for 2026. We'll start with personal taxes, moving to sole proprietorships, and then look at corporations. Along the way, I'll highlight how deadlines vary depending on your specific situation. Finally, we'll bring it all together with a real-life example of a family where one spouse is incorporated and the other operates a sole proprietorship. So whether you are self-employed, incorporated, or just filing a personal return, you'll know exactly where you fit and when to file and pay your taxes to avoid painful penalties and stress. Let's start with the basics, and the easiest filing to discuss, personal taxes. When it comes to personal taxes, there are a few key deadlines you'll want to remember. As we will be covering a lot today, and I'll be providing a lot of data to remember, I've created a downloadable calendar of tax dates that you can access using the link below this video. For the 2025 tax year, your T1 personal income tax return is due on April 30th, 2026. That's also the deadline to pay any balance owing. If you or your spouse or common law partner earn self-employment income, which we will be discussing in the next section, you have until June 15th, 2026 to file. However, the payment is still due by April 30th, even if you file your return later. If your total balance owing was more than $3,000 last year, you may need to pay quarterly installments. You typically may have to pay tax installments if your income does not have enough tax withheld throughout the year. For example, if you are self-employed or have investment, rental, or some other income that is not taxed automatically. The due dates for installments are generally March 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th. But keep in mind that if the deadline falls on a weekend or holiday, it is extended to the next business day. So for example, since March 15th, 2026 falls on a Sunday, the deadline for the first installment is Monday, March 16th. All your tax-related expenses, including charitable donations, must be made by December 31st, 2025, to be included on your 2025 personal return. But the deadline to make RSP contributions for the 2025 tax year is March 2nd, 2026, which is 60 days after the end of the year. Next up, let's talk about sole proprietorship business filings. When it comes to business taxes in Canada, there are two categories: sole proprietors and corporations. Sole proprietors report their business income on the T1 personal return, while corporations file a separate T2 corporate return for each incorporated entity. Many deadlines for sole proprietors line up with personal tax deadlines, but there are some important differences. Corporations, on the other hand, follow a very different set of rules. So let's start with sole proprietorships, and then we'll move on to corporations. For a sole proprietor, as I mentioned before, your business income is included on your personal T1 return using Form T2125. The filing deadlines for sole proprietorships are a bit tricky. The filing deadline is June 15th, 2026, but any balance owing for 2025 must still be paid by April 30th, 2026, similar to personal taxes. So you actually have to pay taxes before you file as a sole proprietor. Strange, right? If you are required to pay income tax installments, those follow the exact dates as personal installments in 2026, which are March 16th, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th. Installment amounts should account for all your taxable income, employment income, dividends, business income, and so on. Now, the complication arises if you are registered for GST-HST as a sole proprietor, because your GST-HST filing frequency depends on your annual revenue, and it's different than your income tax timeline. For monthly and quarterly GST-HST filers, returns and payments are due 1 month after the reporting period ends. For example, January 2026 returns are due by the end of February in 2026, or rather in March, because the end of February is actually a Saturday. For the annual sole proprietor GST-HST filers, the payment for 2025 is still due April 30th. But the GST-HST return itself is due June 15th. See how there are actually two timelines to track. One for income tax filings and payments, and another for sales taxes. Keeping both in mind is very important. Now, if you owed more than $3,000 in net GST-HST in the previous year, you may also have to make quarterly installments. But GST-HST installment payments are due within 1 month after the end of each of your fiscal quarters, not on the 15th of each month like the income taxes. So in 2026, those quarterly GST-HST installments are due on April 30th, July 31st, and November 2nd, because October 31st is a Saturday. And the last installment for 2026 is actually due in 2027 on January 31st. When it comes to provincial sales taxes, Quebec requires QST filings on the same schedule as GST-HST. And British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba each require separate PST or RST filings, and their schedules vary depending on the province. By the way, we have a comprehensive video on Canadian sales taxes where I provide in-depth coverage of everything from registration to filing, risk avoidance, and tax savings. You can watch it next. Finally, if you have employees or subcontractors, you usually need to issue T4 or T4A slips and summaries by February 28. However, again, because as we mentioned before, because February 28, 2026 is a Saturday, the deadline is moved to March 2nd. Corporations file their taxes on a separate T2 corporate income tax return for each incorporated entity. The filing deadline is 6 months after the end of the fiscal year. And keep in mind that the fiscal year is not always aligned with the calendar year. A calendar year runs from January 1st to December 31st, while a fiscal year is any 12-month period a business chooses for accounting and tax purposes. For example, a corporation with a December 31st, 2025 year-end must file its return by June 30th, 2026. But if a corporation chooses March 31st as its year-end, then their tax filing is due on September 30th, 6 months later. I usually recommend choosing a fiscal year-end other than December 31st. Since that's the most common date people choose, you will be competing for your accountant's attention during tax season. You can generally pick any year-end that's convenient for you. Just be mindful that there are some exceptions and complexities, so I always recommend speaking with an accountant before making any tax-related decisions. As with other due dates, if the 6-month deadline falls on a weekend or holiday, it's extended to the next business day. The deadline to pay the corporate income tax balance is earlier. In most cases, the payment is due 2 months after the end of the fiscal year, but smaller businesses that meet certain profitability thresholds may have up to 3 months to pay. For example, a corporation with less than $500,000 in taxable income with a year-end of December 31st, 2025 would need to pay by March 31st, 2026. But another corporation that does not qualify for that extension would need to pay by February 28th or March 2nd. However, they would both need to file by June 30th. Similar to other filers, corporations that owed more than $3,000 in taxes in the previous year may need to make installments throughout the year. By default, installments are monthly and due at the end of each month. However, Eligible small corporations can make quarterly installments instead. For GST/HST, corporations that are monthly or quarterly filers and also have December 31st year-end follow timelines as sole proprietors, but annual filers do not. Monthly and quarterly filers must file and pay 1 month after the end of the reporting period, similar to sole proprietors. But annual filers must file and pay within 3 months after the year-end, which is different from the sole proprietorship timeline. Corporations that owe more than $3,000 in GST/HST, similar to sole proprietorships, may also need to make quarterly installments. And for a December 31st year-end in 2026, those installments are due April 30th, July 31st, November 2nd, and January 31st, 2027. Corporations operating in provinces with separate sales taxes must also meet provincial deadlines. Finally, if a corporation has employees or subcontractors, it must also issue T4 and T4A slips and summaries by March 2nd, 2026, since February 28th falls on a Saturday. Speaking of payroll, keep in mind that regular payroll withholdings, if you pay salaries to people, must be remitted regularly, depending on the CRA remitter type. Most corporations remit payments monthly, with remittances due on the 15th of the following month. But some corporations may be required to remit payments semi-monthly or even more frequently. I know it's a lot of dates. So let's put these dates into perspective and let's look at a family scenario. Let's say we have a married couple, Jim and Mary. Jim has a corporation with a year-end of November 30th and approximately $2 million in annual sales. But his taxable profits is less than $500,000. He also employs 15 staff members and has 2 subcontractors. Mary, on the other hand, runs a sole proprietorship with $300,000 in annual revenue. Both Jim and Mary charge GST/HST to their clients. On the personal side, they make charitable donations. Both had more than $3,000 in taxes payable last year, but only Mary contributes to her RRSP. So now, as we know their situation, let's start with their personal taxes. Because Mary is self-employed, both she and Jim can file their T1 returns by June 15th, 2026, instead of April 30th. If Mary didn't have a sole proprietorship and Jim only had his corporation, their personal filing deadline would have remained April 30th. In other words, Mary's sole proprietorship extends the T1 deadline for both of them. But their tax payments are still due April 30th, 2026. Now, since they both owed more than $3,000 of personal income taxes last year, they must also make quarterly installments on March 16th, because March 15th is a Sunday, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th, 2026. To claim deductions, their charitable donations must be made by December 31st, 2025. And Mary's RRSP contributions for 2025 must be made by March 2nd, 2026, to be included on her return. Mary's business income is reported on her T1 using Form T2125. For GST/HST, because her revenue is under $1.5 million, she qualifies to file annually. That means her GST/HST payment is due on the same day as her income taxes, April 30th, 2026. But the return is due on June 15th, 2026. Jim's corporation must file a T2 return by May 31st, 2026, which is 6 months after his fiscal year end of November 30th. But his corporate tax payment is due only 3 months after his fiscal year end on March 2nd, 2026. Again, because February 28th is a Saturday. By the way, Jim's corporation has 3 months to pay his taxes because his taxable income last year was less than $500,000. Otherwise, the payment deadline would have been 2 months, as we discussed before. Also, since his revenue exceeds $1.5 million, his corporation is required to file GST/HST quarterly, with filings and payments due 1 month after the end of each quarter. For Jim, that means March 2nd, because February 28th is a Saturday, and May 31st, August 31st, and November 30th, 2026 as their filing deadlines. For payroll, Jim must remit tax withholdings monthly by the 15th of the following month. but he must also issue T4 and T4A slips to employees and contractors by March 2nd, 2026. Generally, the slips are due on February 28th, but because of the weekend rule, as we discussed before, Jim gets 2 extra days to file the slips. When you map this on a calendar, Jim's and Mary's year looks busy. There are some overlaps, but also key differences, especially because Jim's corporation has a non-calendar fiscal year. Additionally, Jim's corporation has monthly payroll remittances due on the 15th of the following month. So rather than everything clustering in April, you can see how tax obligations spread across the entire year. That's why planning and cash flow management are so important when it comes to taxes, and also why it's so easy to lose track. Now, every business owner is ultimately responsible for their own filings, but a good accounting firm should guide you through these deadlines on the annual basis. At least that's the mindset our team follows, though I know not every firm approaches it this way. So it never hurts to be informed. I created a 2026 tax deadline cheat sheet, a simple calendar that puts all these days in one place. You can find the link below in the description. If you have any questions about the tax deadlines or would like me to cover a specific topic next, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the channel, please consider subscribing, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.